Okay, it looks like I'm on. All right, I just want to say a couple people are here. We'll see if anybody else shows up, but okay. So we'll get United States into the war, mobilization, a few other things. I did make an assignment today. In your review book, there's a DBQ. Actually, there's a couple sample DBQs, and so the second one, I believe, is on page 522, but I don't have the book right in front of me right now. But is this working? So, yep, okay. So, on page 522, there's a DBQ about the United States entering the war. I don't particularly like the question, but please look at the question and think about how you would answer. Don't worry about a thesis statement for that one. But there are, I believe, 7 documents. Pick 2 of the documents and write a sentence showing how you would use that document to reinforce some hypothetical answer you would give to that question. So related to some fact, just write a sentence how you would relate it. And then for one of those 2 documents that you choose, include HAP. So explain why that document has a certain bias. So it could be why the cartoon is written that way, why the speech was given that way, or even why a map is presented the way it is, why it has that bias. So show that blank believes this, so Hitler believes this because if I have to have the DBQ I'm going to give you to actually do in class right here in front of me. And so here we have a bunch of different documents. So, for example, here's Harry Truman justifying why the atomic bomb was written. So we'd say Harry Truman believed that said the atomic bomb should be dropped. So blank believes this because of, and then include either an historical event that would affect it, so something that relates to it directly historically, or the point of view, what about Truman made him believe this, or the purpose, what he is trying to convince, or he's trying to justify dropping the atomic bomb. So that's what you gotta do for one of them. So either write that, you can handwrite it, take a picture, or a film. I'm just excited for the film. Some of you, I tell you what, budding directors, some of the camera work's amazing. But either do that or type it and submit it in Teams. That might be the easiest. But don't worry about the thesis statement for that one. Just think about how you would use the document. Remember, for the DBQ, you have to use 4 documents, at least 4 of the 5. So that's like 2 a paragraph that show how you would use it to prove your thesis. And then for 2 of those 4, explain why there's this bias, why this believes this. All right, so let's get back to this. So we got the United States there, we had the oil embargo because Japan took French Indochina. And just to review really quick, this is kind of a big deal. It wasn't meant to be a full embargo, but Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson refused to accept applications. And then don't forget Bushido. Bushido was very important here. And so the Japanese decided they're going to get the oil on their own in the Dutch East Indies, the colony of the Dutch East Indies. The problem is British or the American colonies like the Philippines or British colonies like Hong Kong and Singapore might be in the way. So if they could knock out the United States Navy and the Royal Navy, the assumption was the U.S. and Britain would just basically take it. We don't care about the colonies that much. And this is kind of a foolish move, but that was their plan. And then just to review from yesterday, remember Tojo was the general who was the premier of Japan, but it wasn't really one dictator, but he would become the symbol like this horrifically racist cartoon. And so that is where we begin at Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had moved to Pearl Harbor. I believe this is right where we quit yesterday. If I repeat a little bit, just deal with it. All right, so the U.S. Pacific Fleet had moved from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor basically as a threat to the Japanese. Now, the U.S. had begun slowly rearming, while Japan had been fighting a war in China and been building up their fleet. And the thought was, if they could knock out much of the U.S. fleet, the U.S. would just give up. And then this would trigger amphibious attacks all over. And they would attack, and these arrows on the map here kind of show it. They would attack in the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, And they had maybe getting in the Indian Ocean a little bit, but here's the Dutch East Indies. And they also want to take as many islands here to have as bases to make it difficult for the United States, if they wanted to stay in the war, to retake or to try to get to this resource zone in their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So, the Japanese fleet was led by Admiral Yamamoto, who had been in the United States for much of the 1920s, studied at Harvard, and the Navy was reluctant, but they decided to surprise raid 30 minutes after an ultimatum. And I think, yeah, I forgot, I did talk about the torpedo planes yesterday, and the plan was to use torpedo planes and dive bombers to attack the American ships. And it was going to be a two-wave attack, and Japan was going to throw everything at it. They had 6 fleet, which means large carriers that hold between 70 and 100 planes. Well, 90, but they were going to use all of these. And the plan was that the first Japanese planes would be arriving over the Hawaiian Islands 30 minutes after the Japanese diplomats were presenting an ultimatum to the U.S. Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. So think about 6 hours late. So there's a 6-hour time difference, so that's Sunday afternoon. And the plan was to attack on a Sunday, assuming that the United States would be, the men would be just coming back after the weekend, they'd be relaxed, not expecting attack. And also there had been, for that whole month, the U.S. had been on alert, worried about a surprise attack, worried about Japanese saboteurs, maybe there was a huge Japanese immigrant population in the Hawaiian Islands, and the assumption was maybe they would attack. And so this was a good time when the United States would be tired and off guard. And so this is actually a battle map from 1942, but here's the attack on the Hawaiian Islands, an attack all over here. And their plan was to come on the northern route and attack right here. And so, on December 7th, 1941, just after sunup, it would be a two-wave attack. The first wave would hit airfields, and these are one right here. The American planes, the Americans did have a couple hundred planes in the Army Air Corps, soon to be called the Army Air Force at that time, and they were laid out on the runway, in fact, wingtip to wingtip on the runway, fearful that saboteurs would attack them, and it would be easier to guard if they're laid out on the runway, wingtip to wingtip. But you can imagine how that became very easy targets for Japanese planes. Once the American Air Force was whittled down, and they would be, most of it taken totally by surprise, only a few American planes got up, then the second wave would knock out the fleet. So that's the plan. Well, it went partially by plan for the Japanese, partially not. We're not going to go into great detail about all the issues of the battle. But like I said, there would be 6 Japanese carriers in 2 waves. And that is the Japanese carrier Agaki, which was a former battleship. And the Japanese these are their dive bombers, the torpedo bombers, and the Japanese fighter, the A6M-0. And the Zero would become the most famous Japanese plane of the war, highly maneuverable, but the Japanese sacrificed armor and protection for the pilot and the fuel tanks for range and maneuverability. And once American planes and tactics caught up, the Japanese planes were always under-armored and never quite as effective as they could have been. So, what about the ultimatum? So the plan was this ultimatum would be issued, actually it came in 12 parts, and it would be issued kind of bit by bit and then given to Secretary of State Cordell Hull. In fact, that's Hull with the Japanese ambassador right there. But the Japanese did not know that the U.S. had broken much of their diplomatic code, much like what I mentioned before when the British had broken the German code. I think I mentioned that. But yeah, at Benchley Park. I did when I talked about the invasion of the Soviet Union. And so the US had broken the code. And so they had been reading these dispatches. Now, it was really short of a declaration of war, and it was more like the Japanese might attack. In fact, they were worried the Japanese might attack bases in the Philippines or Guam, but certainly not Pearl Harbor, which was thousands of miles away from the Japanese mainland. So they were expecting attacks in the South Pacific and the East Pacific. And so the US had broken their code. And so that night, that last message, essentially ultimatum, the night before the attack, arrived at the Japanese embassy. Well, the US is breaking the code, and the Japanese at the embassy are breaking the code. But the amazing thing was, the United States actually decoded it before the Japanese embassy decoded it. And one more little quirk. Knowing that this was top secret, the Japanese had sent all their American staff home because they only wanted Japanese staff there. And that included their typist. And so when they sent them home, the Japanese had to break the code and then type the message in English with Japanese staff members who did not know how to use an English typewriter. So they're pecking away by hand, finger pecking it away, while the United States had decoded it, typed it, and was actually on Secretary of State Cordell Hull's desk before the Japanese even had it typed. Now, it was not clear enough that this was a declaration of war. It was pretty mealy-mouthed. But the United States had this before the Japanese were ready. And they typed all night and into the next day. It took that long. And so instead of issuing the ultimatum 30 minutes before it arrived, the embassy was 3 hours late. And so when the Japanese diplomats arrived to give that ultimatum, not only did Cordell Hull have it, he already knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor that had been wired across the Atlantic. And he was furious. So this ultimatum turned from being, see, the Japanese warned you, it's pretty duplicitous. But it went from we gave the ultimatum before to a sneak attack. And this sneak attack would infuriate the United States. Without a declaration of war and the desire for revenge, that great poster, Avenge Pearl Harbor, bullets will do it. And then, of course, remember Pearl Harbor, which will remind you of Remember the Maine. And this infuriated the United States. And they would have the exact opposite effect the Japanese wanted, from the United States being pummeled and therefore their morale will drop and say, we can't beat the Japanese, it's not worth it, to revenge. Can you think of anything that would make a country more angry? And the Japanese did this, as it turned out, very similar thing in the Russo-Japanese War 36 years earlier. One more thing too, the United States had radar stations, and that's one of the radar stations on Oahu. And they picked up the Japanese attack coming early that morning, just as the sun was coming up. But the message was ignored. In fact, when it was reported back to base, it was said that it was a flight of American heavy B-17 bombers flying actually from the opposite direction. But this warning was not heeded. So there's other examples, but this is the most famous. And here's one of those B-17 bombers. It landed just as the Japanese were attacking, and the back half was blown away. And half of the crew would be killed in this, to give you an idea how ferocious the battle was. So when the Japanese attack happened, they completely surprised the Americans, knocked out many of the planes on the ground. Here are American planes being knocked on the ground. This is the Naval Air Station. Here's the Army Air Corps Station. So that's American P-40 fighters and other planes hit on the ground. So the first wave was fairly successful.
Yesterday, December 7th,
so,
1921,
the first wave was fairly successful. Hopefully there's no sound coming
a
through.
date which will
I
live
was going to have the sound of
infamy.
Of FDR, and
The United States of America
moved it, but I guess I didn't totally
was
move it.
suddenly and deliberately attacked
Here's what
by naval and
cockpit
air
of a Japanese
forces
plane
of the
flying
Empire
in. You can see
of
the
Japan.
American battleships lined up. The Americans
United
had
States
8
was at
battleships
peace
there, actually
with that
7
nation,
battleships. Most of them were World War I
and
era
at the solicitation
dreadnoughts.
of
And they had
Japan,
been reconditioned and
was
modernized.
still in
But these were relatively
conversation
old battleships. The
with
Americans
its
were making
government
new battleships.
and its emperor,
and this was the target, these big,
looking
heavy,
toward
called
the
capital
maintenance
ships.
of peace in
And
the Pacific.
here is the explosion on, I believe, the Oklahoma. Here are the contours of 2 American battleships as they're hit, and that right there is the Arizona going down. In fact, I believe I have another picture of that. Not again. All right. Yeah, that's the Arizona going down. And with torpedoes and bombs, you notice the way that the American battleships are laid. There are 2 battleships right next to each other. And the battleships on the inside were somewhat protected. But 4 of the 8 were sunk. 4 of the 8 were sunk. 2 of them, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, capsized and sunk, with much of the crew of 400 of the Oklahoma, over 1,000, almost half of the casualties, U.S. casualties and deaths at Pearl Harbor were on the Arizona. And one battleship, the Nevada, tried to make its way out, but as it started sailing out, it beached itself before it could be sunk, blocking the harbor. And much of the other targets were hit, and this was a devastating attack. That American ships were totally unprepared. They did not believe that Japanese torpedoes could work at Pearl Harbor. And as you can see, 4 battleships were sunk. Now, 2 of them were sunk. The West Virginia and the Nevada were actually brought back up. Well, not West Virginia and the California, I'm sorry. They sunk and rested on the bottom of the harbor. They brought them back up and they would fight again. In fact, the West Virginia would be at Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered. I'm sorry, I got something popped up on my screen and distracted me. I'm sorry, that's one of the fun of teaching at home. But the Japanese would make 3 fatal mistakes. 3 fatal mistakes when they attacked. Horrible mistakes. The Japanese should have ordered a 3rd wave, but their admiral of the fleet, Admiral Nagumo, was relatively cautious and thought he'd won a huge victory. We don't need to do anything else. Uh-oh. Can you not hear me at all? Let me ask you now, can you hear me? So, can you hear me now? I'm going to, yeah, I know, fun with sound. You get to see my control panel. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. You can hear me. Good. Let's go back. So did you hear me talk about the carriers, the dry docks, and the oil? The Japanese did not order a 2nd wave, and they did not get the most valuable target, the aircraft carriers. And this would be a horrible mistake. By pure, unadulterated luck, the American fleet carriers were out to sea. In fact, one was coming back from San Francisco, one was in San Francisco, one was in the Southern Pacific. Actually, one, the USS Enterprise, was on its way back from Wake Island and arrived later that day. If the Japanese would have waited a day, they could have sunk 2 of the fleet carriers and the entire course of history might have been different. In fact, one of those carriers was the Enterprise, which would become crucial for winning the war. I'll get to that in a little bit. The next big one were the dry docks. The dry docks were facilities. You can see them right here. Right there. The dry docks were to repair ships. And these were to repair big ships like aircraft carriers and battleships. If those dry docks were not there, if they would have been destroyed, that means that ships would have had to go all the way to San Francisco or San Diego to be repaired, and it would have taken months longer to repair ships and be ready to fight again. And lastly, the oil tank farm. This is just a small part of this. The massive oil reserve for the United States fleet. If they would have knocked that out, the United States would have had a much more difficult time fighting this war because it would have taken longer to build up supplies. If they would have waited one day, knocked out the dry docks and a couple carriers, we might have an entire different course of history. It would have been much more difficult for the United States to counterattack. But the Japanese did not do this, and so you have, yes, it was a victory, but they knocked out old, nearly obsolete battleships, missed the most important target, and infuriated the United States. But to many around, it did not seem that way. By the way, that is the memorial today, and the Arizona which sunk, it is still resting there today, and the memorial is resting on the bottom, or on the hulk of the USS Arizona, which you can see right there. It is still leaking oil to this day, and that is the tomb of over 1,000 U.S. sailors that they could not get out of the ship. And one more interesting thing, I like this picture right here. There's the Arizona Memorial. Right here is the Missouri, a battleship that was completed during World War II, and it was on the Missouri that the Japanese surrendered formally in September 1945. And they're right there next to each other at Pearl Harbor. If you get a chance, that is one of the bigger places to go. And so, Roosevelt would give his declaration of war right here, and this is all weird now. Let's see if this works.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker,
Here's Roosevelt. Once again, we'll hear him
members of the
again.
Senate, of the House of Representatives. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us.
And so the United States declared war on Japan, but the United States now is only at war in the Pacific. And that is when Hitler would make fatal mistake number 6, and the last of the fatal mistakes. So after the United States declared war in the Pacific, and one of the things Hitler was scared of, the U.S. would get involved in Europe. Don't forget, the United States was having an undeclared war in the high seas in the Atlantic. But Hitler, for reasons that cannot be explained, declared war on the United States. Remember, its troops were at the gates of Moscow, and they were losing. They would lose that turning point battle. And yet here is Hitler right here asking the Reichstag to declare war. Now remember, this is a dictatorship now, so asking the Reichstag is like asking himself, but going through the motions according to the Constitution that technically still existed. By the way, yes, the Reichstag had been burned. You remember that. This is the Berlin Opera House. And so Germany declared war on the United States, and Mussolini followed. And this would be it. There is absolutely no chance that Germany can win. With the United States entering the war, and Roosevelt has already acknowledged that the bigger threat to civilization would be Germany, now the United States has an excuse to go to war, and as it would turn out, about 75% of U.S. equipment and manpower would go to fight Germany by 1944. And that should also give you an idea about the size of the United States. One thing I thought this was really funny, here's the New York Times, and it's showing the U.S. now at war with Germany and Italy. Look at this. Japanese checked in all land fighting, 3 of their ships sunk, 2 battleships hit. No! The Japanese had not been checked. This is propaganda and wishful thinking. I just think it's really funny. So, fatal mistake number 6. Hitler sincerely believed that the United States did not want to fight. They were not tough. They were a mongrel race and not one pure race like the Germans, or even though it was a lesser race like the Japanese. And the assumption was, this is a great moment. Now the United States will be stretched thin and can't help anywhere. It was a foolish move. And this was a big moment. All over Europe and in Britain, there was a sigh of relief. We can win this thing. Everybody knew the power of the United States economy, the size of the United States. And even though the U.S. was not a great military power, they could build a lot fast. And, as it would turn out, the American aircraft industry was amazing. But, oops. So, I don't understand. There's another cloud behind you. You know, that is one of those great cartoon scenes. I know what you're thinking. What could that possibly mean? It's time to practice a thesis statement. Of course. So, oops. I got to stop it real quick. This did not work the way I wanted. That's weird. It was supposed to come in a little bit later, but I'm just going to wing it because that's what we do. So let's start again. Let's give a very basic thesis statement. Analyze reasons Japan attacked the United States on December 7th, and we just covered them and reviewed them again. And so I will give you an opportunity to do that. No, I won't play the Jeopardy music. I thought about it. But what I want you to do then is quick write this up. And remember, please do not look at mine. I know you did. I'm just waving my arms for no reason. But so remember, take the main point of the question, X, take a position, Y, and because A and B. So now we're only doing a 4-paragraph essay. And so, quick do that. I'll give you a couple minutes. Think about something, about the ultimate reason why Japan did it, and then a couple of reasons kind of that you would use for paragraphs about why the Japanese did it. Okay, I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, you should be getting pretty close. I'm looking now, you can see me walk by. Okay, so let's go and take a look at it. And here's the one I wrote down. So, attack the United States, I have that. That's my main point. That's my X. To expand their economic empire. Now, you could have been for the desire to get oil, to take the Dutch East Indies for oil. I just decided to include that with the essay. But the economic empire, that is my why. The reason why is for oil. And then, adhering to the view of Bushido. So you can talk about Bushido and the fact they were unwilling to surrender, and after the oil embargo. Now, I would have put down, I would have done the, I don't know why I capitalized the E there, but the oil embargo second, or that my second paragraph, talk about that, and then about Bushido, they could not back down. That's why they attacked at Pearl Harbor. And so that is my thesis. My guess, my hope is a lot of you have that. I'll leave that up. But let's review them. My X, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. So I'm addressing the main point of the question. My position, to expand the economic empire, which is getting the oil. So that's the Y. And then A and B, Bushido, oil embargo. That is a good, sound thesis. It's not, I just wrote it real quick. It's not meant to be perfect, but that is a good example. And you can stop this and go back and look at it if you want. Let's move on. So for the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had huge gains. They would attack all over. In fact, humiliate American forces at Guam, British forces at Hong Kong, attack islands all over, including attacking the American base at Wake. Now here at Wake, American forces would resist at Wake and actually turn back the first initial invasion attempt. Wake is an atoll, so you can see what Wake looks like. Basically, it's an airfield on the very small little islands. And there's a painting of American Marines holding out. The few Marines there and a few Marine fighter pilots held off the Japanese bravely, but no reinforcements could come. In fact, they were turned back before they could get there. So Wake would be this noble, the Americans would try to turn this into this noble effort, but it was a disastrous failure. At Malaya and Singapore would be some of Japan's biggest victories. Malaya is now Malaysia. That was a British colony right here. There's Malaya here. So let's go back. And the Japanese were outnumbered, but they were able to surround, move past the British forces, who used also a lot of Australian and Indian soldiers there. They even rode bicycles to go past them on the roads. I want to give you a picture of the good roads right here. And the British thought was they would stop them here, and then their great fortress at Singapore, this British symbol of power, it would hold out. But instead, the British were humiliated on Malaya. The British and their colonial armies pushed back. The British Empire was totally embarrassed. And one thing that is really important, this idea of European superiority was dashed forever. The thought was that Europeans partially ruled because they were somehow superior, and that's how come they were able to control vast empires with just a few men, most famously what the Dutch did in what is now Indonesia. And this dashed that idea of superiority. There's a few more things happen, but we're just going to get to this basic idea. And the British were poorly led, tied to the roads. The Japanese outmaneuvered them. And don't forget, most of the Japanese soldiers were urban city dwellers like the British. Yet the Japanese were more willing to get out into the jungle and fight. But Singapore would be the biggest failure. Singapore was this mighty British fortress, and it fell in February of 42 with hardly a fight. And right there are its massive guns. They had huge 14 and 16-inch guns all around the harbor. But the problem was they pointed to sea, and the Japanese attacked from the mainland. Here are the British surrendering, a horrible, humiliating defeat. This shocked Britain. They never quite recovered from this. You could argue this is the beginning of the end. By the way, I should add, one man in India was overjoyed by this, Gandhi. Gandhi did not like the militarism in Japan, and he hated Nazi Germany, but the enemy of my enemy, I think you get the point. So it's Singapore. One more thing then. The Philippines, the Japanese attacked the American colony on December 10th. But I should add, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they sent the warning out by telegraph to all American bases. They had underground telegraph lines and also radio connections. And so on the Philippines, they heard that the Japanese attack. And oh no, the assumption was the Japanese would attack the Americans here. So Clark Airfield, which is right here, the biggest Army Air Force base here, had over 100 planes right here. When they heard about the base at Pearl Harbor, they took off all the planes. And they went up there and circled around Clark Airfield so they would not be caught on the ground like they were at Pearl Harbor. And they circled for 3 hours till they ran out of fuel. And then they finally landed. And when they landed, and you cannot make this up, pure bad luck, Japanese planes from Formosa, which is today Taiwan, just happened to hit and destroyed 90% of them. And the U.S. Air Force and the Philippines was taken. Part of the idea of American defense there was the Air Force. The Japanese attacked all over, not huge attacks, but the American and Filipino soldiers and militia there weren't very many, not very well prepared. And when they attacked all over in just a few days, the Americans realized they couldn't hold Manila, and that's Manila as an open city for the Japanese. The commander of the U.S. Army there was Douglas MacArthur, the same guy who ordered American troops to attack the Bonus Army back in 1932. He had to leave the Army because he had an extramarital affair, and it's against the Army Code of Conduct for officers to have an extramarital affair to this day. They could be court-martialed for that. Well, he went to the Philippines to be the commander of their army, and then when war was imminent, Roosevelt, feeling he had no choice, let him back in the U.S. Army. His plan was to take his relatively small army, and they were kind of scattered all over the main island of Luzon, and retreat to this peninsula right here called Bataan, and then hold out and wait for American reinforcements. That is MacArthur right there. So hold out, wait for reinforcements. And on Bataan, the U.S. forces then, U.S. and Filipino forces, so there are maybe 30,000 total American troops, and about 60,000 Filipino, but most were lightly armed militia, and a lot of them went back home. But they held out on this peninsula, really rugged, mountainous peninsula, and they dug in. Soon they were on half and then quarter rations as they ran out of supplies. And here are these are Marines on militia or on Bataan holding out. But when they were down to eating or almost to bare bones rations, waiting for American reinforcements, they held off Japanese attacks for 2.5 months, shocking the Japanese, who just assumed they would surrender like everybody else. But going into April, as they held on this line right here, nearly out of supplies, the Japanese outflanked them and broke the line. Because it was about that time that those on Bataan realized they're never going to be relieved. They're going to fight and then die there or surrender there. In fact, they became known as the battling bastards of Bataan, just holding out, and the Americans were never going to come. After Pearl Harbor, and after all the Japanese victories, the U.S. fleet could never relieve them. And if you want to watch a great movie, watch a movie it's from 1943 called Bataan about this. It's just a kind of a classic World War II era war movie. But eventually, the Japanese would overwhelm them. The main base was this island right here called Corregidor. And Corregidor was this fortified island. And that's where MacArthur was, in these huge underground bunkers you can see to the right. In fact, the men on Bataan used to criticize him, call him Dugout Doug, because he would stay in these fortified bunkers and not come out. Here he is making a kind of a triumphant march, and then he'd run back and hide. The men didn't really like MacArthur. But FDR ordered MacArthur to leave, realizing that MacArthur could represent, at least he had this reputation as a fighter, and he would be snuck out of the Philippines and make it back to Australia and would help lead the counterattack in the South. He would be one of the highest ranked and eventually a 5-star U.S. general. Vastly overrated, but that's another story. Eventually, in April 1942, at Bataan, they surrendered. Those are American and Filipino forces surrendering, and those are Japanese giving the banzai cheer for victory when Bataan fell. And the thing about Bataan, so those prisoners, remember Bushido, The greatest dishonor was what happened to prisoners. And they would do this to the prisoners they took in Singapore, in China, in Burma, every place else. The Japanese brutally treated the prisoners as a combination of they had brought dishonor to themselves, and why should we care about them if they've been abandoned? And they would march them approximately 70 miles up to or 60 miles to a POW camp, and this would become known as the Bataan Death March. About 76,000 prisoners, 12,000 more Americans, so you get the idea of that. A third would die along the way. Here are POWs bringing the bodies of those who had died, being forced to bring those bodies along. Here are American and Filipino prisoners with a short rest. They had no food, no water. If they stopped, they'd be bayoneted. Here are American POWs, some beaten, you can see right there, as they march to this POW camp right here. Here is the memorial that exists today for the Bataan Death March. And this brutalization would be remembered for years, that the word would come out from Filipino guerrillas, and the Americans would hear about what happened and the desire for revenge. When Harry Truman announced the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, that first atomic bomb, when Japan was already basically defeated, but the United States dropped an atomic bomb on them, one of the reasons he gave, one of the justifications, was the Bataan Death March and the treatment of POWs. So this will stick with the United States, this horrible fight to the finish in the Pacific. Here are prisoners of Bataan who survived. Half would die in captivity, nearly starved to death by mistreatment, negligence, and then shortage of Japanese food anyways. Here, when they were liberated, and those are American tankers talking to a POW, you know, see, the guys, the American tankers in combat are nearly starved too. By the way, yes, they wore basically old football helmets, leather helmets. Corregidor would surrender in May 1942. And there's a Japanese surrender on the big guns at Corregidor. And this, a humiliating defeat. The Philippines would stick. MacArthur would have in the back of his mind to rehabilitate his image to get back to the Philippines, so this American colony. But don't forget, these are all colonies. Pearl Harbor was a colony of the United States. The Philippines was a colony. Singapore and Malaya were British colonies. But in 6 months, this would be the extent of Japanese control. They took the British colony of Burma, right to the gates of India, all of Dutch East Indies, part of New Guinea, and then this is more vague, but they controlled many of these islands taken from British, the United States, or their own islands here, as they begin to establish bases. So that's the way it looked. But the United States did begin to counterattack. And a couple counterattacks I'll tell you real quick. The first one's going to be called the Doolittle Raid. And the U.S. were desperate to have some kind of raid back to something to attack the Japanese mainland. And this is Jimmy Doolittle right here. And he came up with the idea to use land-based bombers that were normally too big to take off from an aircraft carrier, and bomb Tokyo and other bases. It would be a small attack, but something to boost morale. And so, the carrier Hornet in April 1942, just after they surrendered at Bataan, they sailed to within 500 miles of Tokyo, in fact, almost out of range, and launched these big for an aircraft carrier, B-25 bombers. This is a great picture of one taking off from the Hornet, turned into the wind, and got just enough lift to get off. And they bombed Tokyo. This was humiliating, did very little damage, but you could get this, this headline really shows that the great bit of propaganda victory. The damage was not heavy. It was a minor damage. Most of the pilots were barely able to fly across. The plan was to fly across and land in China. Most of them crash landed there. A couple crash landed in the Soviet Union, which remained neutral in the Pacific War till the end. But a few that were captured by the Japanese, here is one. They would be executed by the Japanese as war criminals. And you can see that poster. Another one, remember the Doolittle Raid. Doolittle would survive. And so this was, not a huge victory, but the Japanese did not believe an American carrier could get that close. In fact, Roosevelt said it's from a secret base called Shangri-La, which is, if you know anything about the story of Shangri-La, it's a pretty funny story. But now the Japanese, ironically, are desperate. Even though they had won victory after victory, they assumed that after this huge array of defeats, both the British and the United States would bail out. Well, the British were pretty stretched thin, but the United States didn't quit. And what the Japanese wanted was a negotiated peace with terms or conditions, where the United States would just acknowledge that the Japanese had conquered certain areas and just let the Japanese take it. That's what they wanted, a negotiated peace. If anybody thinks Japan wanted to conquer the United States, they did not. All they thought was, quick knockout, they could get the oil. So a negotiated peace. So Yamamoto, this goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan, or what I told you before, they always thought it'd be one big battle. One big battle, and the United States will quit. So the plan was to get one big battle, but after New Guinea was secure. Here's New Guinea right here. And they wanted to take the capital of New Guinea, Port Moresby, but New Guinea, and that would partially isolate Australia. And the thought was, with Australia isolated, it could not be used as a base. My battery is running low. I did not plug in my computer. My battery should not be running low now. But after New Guinea is secured, let me check. Okay, after New Guinea is secured, Australia would be much more difficult to be used as a base for counterattack. And the thought was, okay, Australia can't be used for a counterattack to begin to attack this region here. The United States will quit. So Yamamoto had a plan. If he could threaten here, the U.S. will sail out their fleet, and then he could sink it once and for all in one big victory. But first, here. I should add what the plan was, and we'll come back to this. The furthest western island of the Hawaiian island chain, it's 1,000 miles from Oahu, is an island called Midway, because it's midway between Hawaii and Wake. Midway. It's just another one of these atolls. And what he would do is try to invade Midway. They would invade Midway right here. The Americans would rush their fleet out. Yamamoto would ambush it, sink it, war over. The problem was, remember, the U.S. had broken their code. And the U.S. had broken this code. In fact, they called this operation Magic. So the code name was Magic. They had broken the code, which they dubbed codename Purple. And the U.S. didn't get all the information, but learned that the Japanese were going to attack. Not just here. They didn't know all the details, but here and here. And that's going to lead to two, in a way, kind of turning point battles. The first one is the Battle of the Coral Sea. And because of Magic, the United States was waiting. The U.S. sent 2 of their carriers. And because one of their carriers was hit by a torpedo, the Saratoga was out of action, another carrier was in the Pacific, they only had 4 carriers. And so the U.S. had 4. The Japanese still had 6. The Japanese were going to invade Port Moresby right there. So the invasion force was going to come here, shielded by a Japanese task force with 2 carriers. And this would be the first naval battle in history where the opposing fleets never saw each other. It was all done by aircraft. All done by aircraft. So 2 carriers, the Yorktown and the Lexington, against 2 Japanese carriers, 2 veterans of Pearl Harbor. So we're not going to go into all the details of battle. It's a really confusing battle, but I put up this map here so you can really see how easy it is to follow. I don't think you have any doubt. I can just step back and now you completely understand it. Yeah, it's actually a really confusing battle. Both sides never really could find each other's fleet completely, but the Japanese would lose 1 light aircraft carrier called the Shoho, and 2 of their carriers would be damaged and lose a lot of planes, but never coldly damaged. In fact, these are American planes ready to attack. Here's a painting of American Dauntless dive bombers at Pearl Harbor. You notice how they have the red, they called it the red meatball, right there in the middle, and that would be the last battle that they would have that red dot. They would take that out because from a distance, it looked like the Japanese flag. So if you see any planes from Midway, they hastily painted over that with white paint. And so here, though, is the American aircraft carrier Lexington being hit by a Japanese counterattack. And at this, even though the Japanese got 2 aircraft carriers partially damaged or lost a lot of planes and lost a light carrier, the United States, one of their oldest carriers, the USS Lexington, was sunk. And the other aircraft carrier, this is the Yorktown, and their gas lines got hit. That spectacular explosion looked like the ship is doomed. It actually rose up out of the water. But it was so heavily damaged that the Japanese not only thought it was sunk, but the Americans thought they couldn't save it. It had to limp back at just a few knots, towed by destroyers at first, and then barely under its own power, but limp back to Pearl Harbor to be repaired. In peacetime, this would have taken over a year to repair this aircraft carrier with this much damage. And the assumption was this aircraft carrier is out of action. And so now the Americans are down to 2 carriers. The Japanese still have 6, but 2 of them were damaged at Pearl Harbor, but they still have 4. And so they got back to Pearl Harbor. But remember that when I said they didn't get the dry docks, this is going to lead directly. No, I should add, almost forgot. This battle would be a strategic American victory. Because how strong the American defense was, the Japanese pulled back from They pulled back and never did invade Port Moresby. And Port Moresby would survive. The Australians would hold it. But we're leading to the Battle of Midway. And so this happened a month afterwards. So imagine the Yorktown just barely making it. The new commander, which I'll get to a little bit later, the commander of the American fleet was Admiral Chester Nimitz. And Nimitz ordered every single person at Pearl Harbor who could hold a wrench to be waiting. And when the Yorktown, there it is, limped in there, and they got into the dry dock as quickly as possible, and it was swarmed by thousands of workers. It would have taken a year in peacetime. 6 months, they figured, in wartime. They had it out and ready to fight in 48 hours. If there weren't the dry docks, this couldn't have happened. And it was still leaking fuel. It still had almost 1,000 civilian workers on the Yorktown still working on it as it sailed out to fight the Japanese. But this would be decisive. And also one of the great stories in American history. And so, here's another easy to follow map. Okay, sorry. Let's get back to this. The Japanese plan was a diversion in the Aleutian Islands. But then 4 aircraft carriers under the Nagumo, the same guy at Pearl Harbor, would attack Midway and then an invasion force at Midway. They expected the Americans to come late, but the Americans were waiting for. Nimitz had ordered 3, basically all the U.S. has right here to wait for them. And I just thought this map was funny because you have no idea what happened here. Somebody put a lot of time and effort to show nothing. But on this battle, you notice it took basically over 3 days, but it's mostly on the 4th. The Americans discovered the Japanese carriers. And I can't go into great detail about this battle, but this easy to follow map should tell you everything you need to know. But that's actually American Japanese anti-aircraft fire when the first raids came. By a combination of a bunch of events where American torpedo planes flying low were ambushed by Japanese fighters and almost all of them shot down. But none of them were ready for these planes, the dive bombers, who, by pure fluke, because most of them were lost and could not find the Japanese fleet, they arrived over 3 aircraft carriers at once, totally taking the Japanese by surprise, and in one quick action, knocked out 3 carriers. Just boom, the Japanese lost 3 carriers almost immediately, And by the end of the day, the 4th Japanese carrier was sunk. As you can tell from that easy to follow map. One of the most decisive, incredible victories in history. The Japanese were totally ambushed. The Americans knocked out 4 carriers, all 4. That's the Hiru, the last Japanese carrier to be sunk. And these are 2 pictures of the Agaki that would be sunk by American dive bombers. All of them, all sunk. Now, unfortunately for the United States, here is the Yorktown being hit. The Yorktown would be damaged and the Yorktown would sink. But most of the crew would survive, even though they had a lot of people die. But the United States did lose 4 carriers. Midway survived, but more importantly, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers. Midway was one of the most decisive and shocking victories in American history. The Japanese had just a pretty crazy, elaborate plan, but this would be the turning point. The turning point in the war. To give you an idea why it's a turning point, U.S. production, just in aircraft carriers, for the rest of the war, the U.S. would make 24 fleet carriers. That means they could hold over 90 planes. 8 light carriers that held about 45 planes. And 125 escort carriers that could hold 20 planes. That's what the Americans would produce for the rest of the war. The Japanese built 2 fleet and 6 light carriers. The Japanese production would be overwhelmed. So the Japanese plan now, just hold out. Get the best terms they can. Hold out and make it so awful for the Americans they'll eventually want peace. And here's a horrifically racist Dr. Seuss cartoon showing the Midway turning the tide sick. Great cartoon to show you not only how people realized at the time what a big deal Midway was, but also how racially charged this battle was. And that would be the turning point. Let me get to one more thing before I quit. So, with that, we are going to start very quickly mobilization. And it took a little bit longer than I want, but it's so interesting to talk about this. And I wanted to get the thesis statement in, talk a little bit about various things. And then I had to stop a little bit because we had sound issues. But let me get to one more thing. World War II, 42-43, the U.S. is going to build up for war. By the way, World War II, it's a titanic struggle. But the United States is going to have to mobilize for war. And this is total war. So I put this easy to follow chart. Look at that chart. That's an organizational chart. I still can't figure it out. So the president on down. Now, it must have been huge. But all you do is just if you can recreate this chart, I think you could probably pass any test I give you. But the United States adopted total war. Propaganda, there would be elements of all of the parts of total war I talked about before, literally taking over the economy. But remember a couple things. This was unlike World War I. The United States was attacked, and Germany did declare war. So it wasn't like World War I, where the United States had to encourage people to join. So yes, a lot of people did not want to be forced into the army, did not want to change everything and sacrifice for the war, but it wasn't the same thing. Couple things really quick. The U.S. military exploded in size, and this truly was a citizen army. Conscription of the draft began, and here's picking the lottery number. That's actually the first one. Here are men coming in. Originally it was 19 to 40, eventually be 18 to 46 would be allowed in. After 1942, there'd be no volunteers. Everybody's going to be drafted. And so the idea was we're not going to have people picking and choosing. We will choose where we need men. If we need more sailors or whatever, we'll choose it. And to give you an idea how things changed, here's the rapidly training of the Army. By the way, our troops were, especially the Army, was very poorly trained for the fighting they're going to have, but the Marines to a lesser degree. But most of the U.S. Army, they were trained as an offensive army, and especially fighting the Germans. The Germans were masters of the counterattack. This would have serious repercussions. But to give you an idea how things changed, the average age of the Army on D-Day, 1944, 26 years old. Look what it was by the end of the war, 19. And so more and more younger and younger men went in. So the U.S. built this massive army, but it had to be overnight. Yes, the U.S. started in 1940, the first peacetime draft near the end of 1940. But even when Pearl Harbor hit, the army was still tiny, absolutely tiny. The architect of the U.S. Army would be George Marshall. General Marshall was the most widely respected U.S. soldier of the 20th century. And he's one of the most widely respected soldier that most people don't know. He was so high ranking, here he is as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that they couldn't find an appropriate position for him that was a high ranking enough. But he was the architect of victory. And the U.S. Army would eventually have 8 million men, and that included of the Army. Look how big the Army Air Force, 2.4 million men. Combat soldiers, 2.75 million men. That's the Army. The Navy had 4.2 million men. The Marines, 660,000. I'm not going to make you know these total numbers. If you can do the math, we're talking almost 16 million men total in uniform. But that should give you an idea just how big the U.S. Armed Forces got. 80,000 planes, 6,200 ships. I mean, the U.S. has about 220 ships in the Navy right now. And the Marines, which was a relatively tiny force, became a huge part of the U.S. military, technically part of the Navy, but don't tell them for good reason. And so that's the architect of victory. And all right. And so I got to quit now. Didn't go quite as far as I want, so I'll finish mobilization tomorrow, talk about the first, and then the war after this. It's really important to understand how it happened. And then we'll finish the war with mobilization and then get to why they dropped the atomic bomb. Why they dropped the atomic bomb not only would be a trigger of the Cold War, but would also make a great DBQ. No questions? All right, so you have the 5 days or so to finish up those couple documents. I have some reading. We have notes. We're good? All right. On that happy note, I am going to say, if there are no questions, there are none. It all seem to work? Okay. Then I am done. Goodbye. I'll be on about the same